Chapter 13, Section 2. Level 3, My Story. My story began as a very young girl. I was a very gentle, peaceful, and very quiet child, and preferred my own company, happy to remain alone, but always in the peace and silence, surrounded by all of the elements of all earth's nature, such as walking my dogs for hours on the long stretches of golden beach, listening to the angry and cold ocean crashing on the miles of untouched shoreline, or cycling 3 miles to help a lovely retired old couple with their small goat farm, milking the goats, or digging the vegetable garden, or picking apples and pears in the orchard. These were some of the most blissful times in my life, because I was literally in love with all of the beauty and purity of all that belongs only to all earth's nature. The animals, the birds, the insects, the trees, the lush green woods, the wild flowers, the sights and smells of the golden crops in the meadows, the fertile soils, and the green, lush valleys and countryside that stretched for miles. Only this connection to nature gave me a reason for my life, nothing else. However, as a young girl, I had no idea that this lifelong love of nature would one day, over 40 years later, take me by great surprise. One particular Sunday as a young girl, my family took a car ride to one of our regular Sunday weekend outings into the peaceful hills and remote countryside to have a picnic and small walk in the nature. These outings happen nearly every Sunday, when all of the family would gather together, get in the car and head off into the remote hills. This is why Sundays for me were my greatest and happiest days. I would spend the entire week waiting and looking forward to these sacred Sundays. My heart would sing with joy whenever my father announced we're going for a walk in the countryside. The beauty and depths of the deep green hills, the carpets of purple heathers, fresh tufts of lush grasses and bright green ferns, the old stone bridges, and the small running streams that trickled over the clean, clear, cold, silky smooth, shimmering, multicoloured pebbles. The white dots of the sheep grazing in the deep green valleys below. The old dry stone walls, and each stone placed had a story of its own, handpicked by my ancestors. This is how my childhood memories took on another meaning in my life, because this is when I first began to experience a deep respect for our fragile earth, and all of the purity and beauty of all that belongs to all earth's nature. And throughout my childhood I would spend hours contemplating why I felt such a strong connection to our earth. And it wasn't until many years later that I would finally understand these reasons. However, after our walk this one particular Sunday, we returned back to the car to have our small picnic lunch. But there was always arguments happening in our family when we all got together on these Sunday outings. And this particular Sunday, sparks were flying. And so I decided to disappear for a few moments to be alone in the peace and silence, so that I could connect to all the purity, peace and beauty that belongs only to all earth's nature. I walked, wondering and admiring the elegance of the birds sailing above my head, the ancient grey-green boulder rocks, the fresh clumps of the green lush grasses and young ferns curling their heads up to the midday sunlight, the blue skies canopied with cotton-white clouds, the peaceful sheep grazing, focused and oblivious of all else except lunch, the deep brown peaty soils and the sweet pure smell of the earth, the brightly coloured array of yellow, purples and pinks of the wild flowers. And while I was walking alone in a deep, peaceful, contemplative state, I came across some more large ancient boulder rocks. But these rocks had a very rare and unusual plant attached to them called lichens. These are unusual because most botanists would tell you that lichens are not really plants and do not exist in many places any longer in our world today, because lichens will only grow in the most purest of air. Actually, lichen is not really a plant, but instead its origins come from a composite organism that arises from algae or cyanobacteria, or both, that lives symbiotically among fungus, and that lichen is one of our very old and ancient plants that has existed on Earth as a living composite organism for many millions of years. Do you remember in the adaptation chapter when we discussed this very ancient plant, lichen? And so the earth was giving me signs and clues that the air, the fertile soils, the streams, the moisture in the atmosphere, and the earth's nature itself, where I stood at that very moment, were of the most purest of elements of oxygen that can be found in nature here on our earth. And even today we can still find lichen growing, but only in areas that are free from all toxic pollutions in the atmosphere. It has to be the most purest of air that can be found on our planet Earth today. On that particular day, at that very young, quiet and unassuming, gentle young girl, standing alone in the peace and silence, surrounded only by the beauty and purity of all Earth's nature, I suddenly began to feel a very deep intuitive sadness. I didn't know where this sadness was coming from, and it took me over 40 years later to find these answers. As mentioned earlier, there was always quarrels and arguments happening in our family when we all got together on these Sunday family outings, because most of my siblings had developed strong ego emotions. They were not happy to be dragged away from their friends and other hobbies, and always moaned when my father announced, "We're going for a walk." But this particular Sunday was different, because while we were all sitting having our picnic, these heated arguments became unbearable. I got up and walked away. I couldn't understand what all of the fuss was about. I couldn't understand why all of my siblings were not happy to be here and to give their respects to the creation of all of the purity and beauty that belongs only to all Earth's nature. I just couldn't understand all of this moaning and complaining. And this is when I first knew that I was very different from most other children, because although I had developed my own set of different illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions, picked up and stored in my long-term memory throughout all of these different childhood emotional events, I had not yet developed these ego emotions to become dominantly stored into my long-term memory. Instead, throughout my childhood, most of my childhood, I had remained in my peaceful, childlike, innocent and pure, altruistic emotions. But things were about to change, because at the age of 16, I was about to leave my family home and set out into the great wide world to face my own struggles for my own individual survival. And by doing so, all of my ego survival emotions would then begin to rise to the surface in my long-term memory and begin to suppress all of my pure, happy and peaceful, innocent, childlike, altruistic emotions. This is the reason that I began to feel this instinctual sadness as a very young girl, standing alone on this particular Sunday, surrounded by all of this purity and beauty that belongs only to all Earth's nature. Because I had no idea at that time that it would take me over 40 years to find the practical solutions to reinstate my altruistic emotions to become dominantly stored into my long-term memory again. I was also unaware at this time, as a young girl, that all of this purity and beauty that belongs only to all Earth's nature had been created through the highly intelligent universal law of nature, and that one day, over 40 years later, once I had found the practices to retrain and reinstate my altruistic emotions to become dominantly stored into my long-term memory, this combination would lead me to discover some of the greatest gifts and miracles that all of mankind has tried to find for thousands of years. As mentioned, I still continued to retain my altruistic emotions throughout my adult life, but they had become greatly suppressed, having now developed in adulthood many of my more dominant adult ego survival emotions. I knew that I had retained my altruistic emotions because I still felt a heightened sense of awareness for all others' suffering. And throughout my life, I still took action to rescue many different stray and abandoned animals that instinctively turned up at my doorstep, needing food, warmth, comfort, compassion, and a little human love and kindness. And I still volunteered a small amount of time to help a few non-profit groups to help protect nature in all different capacities, such as planting trees or bird and wildlife surveys, recycling and spending hours picking up rubbish on my walks in the nature and countryside. And on a few occasions, I even organised a couple of volunteer groups to help pick up all of the rubbish on our lands and to recycle. We made this a fun day out with a picnic at the end of this hard work. But becoming a vegetarian was the most difficult thing to do. But after many years of research, I found a very good high-dose vitamin B12 and iron supplement that gave me the strength to continue and persevere. It was simply a process of elimination, finding the right foods and vitamin supplements that suited my new plant-based diet. This is why I have the utmost respect for all vegetarians and vegans, because they show us all that we can all survive happy and healthily with some very tasty foods without eating meat and without hurting and harming animals. In my late 20s, I decided to change my career from working with horses because of the huge physical demands on my body. Instead, I began to take my life a little more seriously. I first studied a 2-year agricultural diploma, equivalent to A-level qualifications. And this then led me to begin my true vocation and my newfound passion for the study of plants, horticulture. I began working for a chain of well-established plant nurseries, but after a few years the owner passed the business to his son, and unfortunately the family business began to fail. This is when I made a big decision to go to university to gain a Bachelor of Science degree in horticulture. I already knew that I had this natural gift and I wanted to make horticulture my new vocation. But after qualifying with my first degree, I decided to continue to gain a master's degree from Imperial College London, specialising in agricultural and horticultural biological control methods, organic in other words, including the study of integrated pest management practices. This is how I first became aware of some of these very serious environmental issues that we have already discussed throughout Chapter 10. Remember, however, that to go to university was a very difficult decision to make, because all throughout these 4 years of study, I had to work in jobs throughout the study, weekends and holidays, to earn enough money in order to support my study and lodgings and food, etc. As mentioned earlier, I was not born with a silver spoon in my mouth. All that I had achieved in my life has been my own making, and this gave me the strength and emotional courage to persist against all odds, to persevere and never give up, no matter how difficult life got at times. And it also gave me great insight into my own human behaviours, because I was well aware of my own struggles and fights to survive through my need for money that continued to develop all of my different ego emotions, but I was still determined, against all odds, to always hold on to my pure and innocent altruistic emotions of empathy, loving kindness and compassion towards others, no matter how difficult my life got at times. That is why any small leisure time that I had at university, I spent outdoors in nature, hill walking and climbing mountains with a group of students, to give all of my thanks, love and respect to nature for all that nature has given to me. And throughout my life, that is why I always remained devoted to all earth's nature, the animals and all that has been created, pure and beautiful, that belongs to all earth's nature, because I knew that only the great universal law of nature and Mother Earth created all of this purity and beauty. And that is why one day in my late 40s I began to create an environmental awareness social media channel to try to find the help and support for many non-profit groups, academics and individuals that were working hard to protect all vulnerable that belongs to all Earth's nature in many different capacities, such as reforestation volunteer tree planting groups in Tanzania, organic growers living in remote communities in Africa, small non-profit stray animal shelters caring for many hundreds of stray and abandoned dogs and cats, and many different wild and farm animals, wildflowers and wild bird protection groups, even amateurish ocean and marine videos to support marine scientists and marine turtles. I also created a couple of small amateurish videos to help to find donations for a small group of orphan children in Africa. But these amateurish videos were by no means professional, and so after a couple of years I decided to delete these videos. But I never gave up and continued teaching on my social media environmental awareness channel and writing this book, this very big book. However, once I reached my late 40s, my own set of ego emotions had now taken over control in my long-term memory, and I now longed and yearned to find a way to return to the memories of my childhood, when I had developed more dominantly my long-term memory, my altruistic emotions that began and gave me such purity, blissful happiness and complete peace within. I needed to find some practical solutions to reinstate my altruistic emotions to become dominantly stored into my long-term memory. And this is when I first began to research practical solutions, because I knew that whatever methods or practices I found, they had to be disciplined, focused, and effective enough to distract my very dominant ego emotions for sufficient periods of time that would effectively begin to release and heal my ego emotions that were now dominantly stored in my long-term memory. This would be the greatest challenge, because I knew that I could never, ever underestimate the strong power and control that my own set of ego survival emotions had over all of my advanced, altruistic emotions. But luckily, one day, through my research, I found the teachings of these focused attention, mindful meditation practices, just like these Tibetan Buddhist monks. And so I began to practice to first focus my thoughts and attention for a couple of hours each morning on reinstating some brand new altruistic emotions of empathy, unconditional love, loving kindness and compassion for self, for all of the ego emotional wounds and suffering I had gone throughout my life since my early childhood, struggling and fighting to survive as a human. Because through these disciplined and determined daily practices, this would help me to release and heal all of my old ego emotional wounds and suffering. After a couple of years of daily disciplined and determined focused attention mindful meditation practices, getting up each morning at 5 a.m. before all of the distractions of noise pollution began to drift into my awakened state, neuroplasticity slowly began to release and heal all of my old, stored ego emotional wounds and suffering from my long-term memory. At this stage, I began to gain heightened awareness and to recognize that my own set of ego emotions had been holding me back from my own loving kindness and compassion towards myself, because I had put so much emphasis on blaming myself. But remember that these were not conscious blames and hurts, because they began in my very early childhood and developed throughout my life, and therefore they had simply become stored unconsciously, in other words, involuntarily and unknowingly, into my long-term memory as my own set of different, illogical, irrational ego blame and hurt emotions. And this is when I began to acknowledge that we all do this. We have all stored our own set of different, illogical, irrational ego, fear or hurt emotions since our very early childhoods, and that none of us are aware of this, but we all continue to react with these ego, fear or hurt emotion behaviours whenever we are upset, angry, hurt, hate, have fear, stressed, anxious, or having any other ego emotional wounds or suffering. And this is how we continue to accumulate similar ego emotions throughout our childhoods. And once we all reach young adulthood, we have to survive on our own 2 feet and fend for ourselves. And this is when our ego survival's emotions kick in and take over control in our long-term memories. And that is how they continue to get activated throughout our lives and throughout all of our adulthood to become our own set of individual and different adult ego emotional behavioural patterns. I continued with these daily focused attention mindful meditation practices for self for a good couple of years, and this is when I first began to realise how much my own ego emotions had been holding me back all of these years from my own blissful happiness, loving kindness, harmony, wellness and peace within myself. I began to feel free, released and healed from these ego burdens that had weighed me down for so many years. I then began to recognise how most other people that I had met throughout my life were also carrying huge ego emotional wounds and suffering. And this is how I began to stop reacting to any other person's extreme ego behavioural patterns. And instead, I simply stopped, stepped back and walked away from any difficult ego interactions and ego power struggles whenever I became face to face with any difficult people. I also stopped connecting and listening to all different fear-based media news, all fear-based social media, all fear-based TV and fear-based movies, fear-based books, fear-based news, fear-based newspapers, and all fear-based information. Because once I had made these adaptations my routine daily practices for long enough periods of time, in other words, for a good couple of years, I began to recognize how much ego emotions had been ruling and controlling my life in my past adult life. I began to feel happier, more loving kind towards myself, and more at peace within myself. By the time I had completed 2 years of these determined and disciplined altruistic practices for self, this is when I knew that it was possible, through the help of my working memory, priming techniques, and my own brain's incredible process called voluntary neuroplasticity, to change the emotional information stored in my long-term memory. And this is when I felt more than ready, happy and willing to begin the next level in my own personal journey of emotional adaptation, and begin daily focused attention, mindful meditation practices to focus all of my attention and thought patterns on the altruistic emotions for all others. In other words, empathy, compassion, unconditional love, loving kindness, positive and peaceful thoughts, and generosity of my human spirit towards others, including all vulnerable that belongs to all Earth's nature. After another couple of years of daily discipline practices, getting up at 5 a.m. and spending a couple of hours each morning before all noise pollution entered my awakened state, I began to focus all of my attention and altruistic thought patterns on others. This is when I began to develop a greater sense of heightened awareness for others' suffering. This is why altruistic emotions are associated with the emotional behaviours of the collective consciousness. Remember that my altruistic thought patterns of empathy, unconditional love, loving kindness and compassion towards others was now able to create material realities of healing towards others, mass. Similar to these Tibetan Buddhist monks' practices, but I was still very aware that many people throughout my life had caused me a great deal of personal ego emotional wounds and suffering. But I now knew the reasons why this had happened, and that is why it also took a great deal of strength and courage to forgive all those extreme ego-driven individuals, because forgiveness is the greatest test of our altruistic emotional behavioural patterns. But the full development of my altruistic emotional behavioural patterns were not the only changes that began to take place in my long-term memory, because after a couple of years of these practices I began to feel as though I was on a permanent emotional high. In other words, a heightened sense of wellness within myself, just like some of these expert but gentle Tibetan Buddhist monks who began to experience heightened levels of emotional blissful happiness, peace and harmony within themselves. It's almost impossible to explain in words how this made me feel, but it was almost as though I felt like each day I was living in Shangri-La, paradise here on earth, because my own individual altruistic thought patterns, energy waves, were now creating my own individual material realities, mass. And so I now began to resonate on a much higher level of this emotional frequency. But then something else began to happen, and although I didn't know this at the time, this became the beginning stages of this final level of my own personal journey of emotional adaptation Level 3. Because I now had a strong need and want to be alone, and to spend time alone in external meditative peaceful state of silence, surrounded only by all of the purity and beauty that belongs only to all earth's nature, so that I could honour and give my gratitude and respect to our home, our incredible Mother Earth, for all that she has provided and given to me, and all, by the way, created by the great universal law of nature. Everything that I owned, and all that has kept me alive all these years, has been created by the great universal law of nature. For instance, the sun's light energy, moisture, Earth's elements and carbon dioxide that converts into photosynthesis to grow all of our trees and plants, that converts tree and plant materials also into all of our fertile agricultural soils, and through photosynthesis is the only source that has grown all of my edible crops, fruits and foods, that has kept me alive all of these years, and all of the trees and plants that has converted into a carbon capture, to capture all of the carbon dioxide and prevent all toxic greenhouse gases from entering into our Earth's atmospheric ozone layer. And through photosynthesis, trees converts carbon dioxide into oxygen for the air that I breathe each day. And all trees in our forests create new rivers and streams to flow, and provide me with all of my fresh water I drink each day. The raw materials of my home that I live in, and all of the comfort of my home, the furniture, clothes, my bed, my kettle, my laptop, my phone, all that I own has been created by Mother Earth's resources. But I don't use fuel to travel on aeroplanes any longer, and I no longer buy unnecessary consumer products unless it's absolutely, urgently necessary. I spent thousands of hours of daily external meditative practice over the next couple of years, walking alone in the peace and silence to honour and give my gratitude and respect to the great universal law of nature for creating all of the purity and beauty that belongs only to all Earth's nature. And this is when, one day, after thousands of hours of daily practices, my now brand new set of dominant altruistic thought patterns, energy waves, began to receive signals from the great universal law of nature. And just like a boomerang, this is how I first began to receive small gifts and miracles from the great universal law of nature, that were small but very clear signs and messages that I was now communicating with the highly intelligent universal law of nature, mass. At first I took these signs and messages as coincidences, but after these small gifts kept repeating too many times, I simply couldn't recognise them as a coincidence any longer. This is when I began to acknowledge that I had discovered the secrets to the greatest connection that all of mankind has tried to find for thousands of years. This is why Level 3 is going to be extremely difficult to discuss, because these theories have only been experienced by a very few individuals throughout mankind's history, and have never been fully explained by anyone ever before. And for that reason you will have to bear with me, because you may have to broaden your outside view of the current realities of your life today, the realities that most of us know in our modern world today. Level 3. Each morning I would wake up at 5 a.m. and spend a couple of good hours each day in disciplined, focused attention, mindful meditation practices, to focus my altruistic attention and thought patterns towards others, and towards all that is vulnerable that belongs to all Earth's nature, as mentioned earlier. And each day, after completing these meditation practices, I would go outdoors, and spend a good couple of hours walking alone, surrounded by the peace and silence, purity and beauty that belongs only to all Earth's nature, so that I could give my respect and gratitude to the great universal law of nature for creating all that belongs to our beautiful and very special planet Earth, including my own life as a human. I wanted to give all of my gratitude and thanks to the great universal law of nature for always providing me and all humans with enough of nature's resources, food, warmth, shelter, and comfort, the only source of our human survival. After several years of these daily external meditative practices, something began to emerge that I still, even today, can't quite believe happened. Because this is when, after thousands of hours of external meditation practices, all of these missing pieces of this huge emotional jigsaw puzzle that I couldn't quite figure out as a very young girl began to fit together. Because this is when I first began to recognize the reasons why I enjoyed this external meditation, peace and silence, and why I preferred to be alone in the company of all of the elements of all Earth's nature. Because I had now re-established more dominantly in my long-term memory my own set of advanced altruistic emotions. And this meant that all that I was thinking and all that I focused my thought patterns on, in other words, energy waves, became filled only with pure thoughts and pure emotions of altruism, empathy, compassion, loving kindness, unconditional love, happy, blissful, innocent and peaceful thoughts and emotions. Mass. And this is when, after thousands of hours of external meditative practices, walking alone in the peace and silence, in all of the purity and beauty of all Earth's nature, suddenly, one day, I began to receive signals, just like the signals that connect us on our mobile phones. But these were signals that were now sent from my own pure altruistic thought patterns, energy waves, that began connecting and communicating with the pure energies of the universal law of nature. I could think whatever I wanted, and the great universal law of nature would receive my thoughts and send my thoughts back and into my own material realities. And this is how I began to receive small material gifts and miracles from the great universal law of nature, Mass. After I began to receive so many of these small gifts and miracles, I could no longer put them down to just simple coincidences. And even on a very few, very special occasions, sometimes these small gifts and miracles began to appear even before my thoughts had even entered into my head. How could this be? What was occurring? Although I tried to explain throughout Chapter 8 how our own thought patterns, energy waves, manifest into our own material realities, Mass, I had no explanation for why these small gifts and miracles that sometimes appeared even before my thoughts had even entered into my head. Therefore, I can only describe these manifestations as my authentic connection with the highly intelligent universal law of nature. And each day I woke up and felt pure, altruistic emotions of extreme bliss, peace, harmony, and complete joy and happiness to have discovered this high level of existence. And each day I felt as though I had found Shangri-La, and how to live in paradise here on earth. And so I continued to walk alone for hours in meditative external contemplation, in the peace and silence, connecting to all of the purity and beauty that belongs to all earth's nature, not quite taking it all in, and not quite understanding what was happening, and what I had discovered. And every day I would wake up, blink my eyes, as though this was all a dream. But it wasn't a dream, it was the reality of my existence, an existence that I had never known before, because I had spent most of my adult life stuck in my old ego survival emotions, my old ego patterns of behaviours that was simply created by my old past memory, the memory that had controlled my life and my existence for so many years, based on my ego needs to obtain money for my survival. That is how I had become a slave to money. I spent hundreds of days and thousands of hours walking alone, in the peace and silence, respecting, admiring, and giving my complete gratitude to the great universal law of nature, with such highly elated emotions that I simply wanted to shout out and to share these incredible enlightened epiphanies with the world. I wanted everyone to know what this connection felt like, so that everyone could find the solutions to live through these altruistic emotions of the collective consciousness, and all find the solutions to begin to receive these small gifts and miracles from the great universal law of nature. However, you may think that to achieve this ultimate level of existence was an easy process, but it wasn't at all easy. It took many years and a great deal of daily disciplined practice and determination, because at this stage, and while all of this was going on, and while I was practicing and dedicating my entire life to these thousands of hours of daily external meditation practices, surrounded only by the pure and peaceful, beautiful elements of all earth's nature, it meant that I had to sacrifice all other material comforts. In other words, I literally ran out of money. I began to live on approximately €2 each week. But at this stage, money wasn't an issue, because the great universal law of nature always provided me with whatever I wanted and needed. I only had to ask, or not even ask, just naturally think, and it would appear. But some of the most difficult problems that I had to face was a few family members and friends who were dominantly developed with extreme ego greed for money behaviours, who couldn't understand why I was not focusing all of my attention on chasing money for my survival. And so they continued to bombard me with ego criticisms, thinking that I was a careless waster, a no good, someone who couldn't take life's material responsibilities seriously, someone who couldn't focus on trying to get a normal routine job to make money and to pay for my existence. It was hard to fight the humiliation of these ego-driven behaviours, but if I had listened to these harsh and hurtful words, none of you would be reading these messages today, because most of these ego criticisms were the hardest struggles that I had to face, because I had to have the determination to persist against all odds and not give up, not allow my own personal ego survival emotions to rise to the surface and take over the control of my now new gentle and peaceful altruistic emotions that were now more dominantly stored in my long-term memory. Because apart from these hurtful ego criticisms, these were the most happiest, peaceful, and the most blissful times in my entire adult life. So what were these small gifts and miracles that I continue to receive from the highly intelligent universal law of nature? While I was walking home from a long day out in my external meditation, surrounded by the peace and silence of all earth's nature, a thought crossed my mind, energy wave, that I needed to make a vegetable casserole, but I didn't have the money for vegetables. And suddenly, while I was walking along a peaceful, quiet dirt track, an old man stopped his farmer's truck, got out and greeted me and handed over a small bunch of carrots, tomatoes, leeks, potatoes and oranges, mass. I very graciously thanked the old man and continued walking home. These were all small gifts and miracles that continued to appear like this, given and received from the great universal law of nature, that continued to keep me alive for many months. And because these small gifts and miracles continued to appear, I never felt fear or hardship, hunger or suffering, because I knew that the great universal law of nature was providing me with these gifts and miracles. This is why these were the happiest times in my life. On another instance, while I was walking in the peace and silence, alone, in deep external meditation, one morning, a thought energy wave suddenly entered my head that I really needed to find a very small amount of money to buy some credit for my phone. But this time, the great universal law of nature could not provide this for me, because all of the gifts that I had received so far had all been created by the great universal law of nature. But this particular morning, while I was walking alone in the nature, in deep and peaceful external meditation, I came across a farmer's field. And there, in the middle of the field, I looked down just to discover a €10 note lying in the middle of the field, mass. I could no longer put all of these coincidences down to just simple coincidences. I had discovered the solutions to connect to the higher source of the great universal law of nature that was much greater and much bigger than me and all us humans, because it created all us humans and all that belongs to our fragile planet Earth and our universe. On another occasion, I was working away in quiet and peaceful external meditative contemplative practices in my garden, growing my organic vegetables, when suddenly a thought energy wave came into my head that I had no tomatoes left on my tomato plants and I wanted to make a salad. And a couple of hours later I received a knock on my door, and one of my neighbours was standing in front of me holding a big bag of tomatoes. "We are going away for a few days and we don't want to leave this food in the fridge rotting. Will you eat these for us?" Of course, these are only a few small examples, but there were so many small gifts and miracles that I continued to receive throughout most of my days and throughout these thousands of hours of daily, external and peaceful meditation practices, surrounding myself with all of the peace and silence that can be found only in the purity and beauty of all earth's nature. These small gifts and miracles kept on appearing, and as mentioned earlier, many of these times, even before my thoughts had even entered into my thought patterns. This is how I knew that these material gifts and miracles were mostly, definitely signals that I was receiving, connecting my thoughts to the pure, universal energies of the law of nature. Not coincidences, but gifts given to me by this pure connection. And at that time, I may have been one of the poorest of people in the world. But if we assess my life in material monetary wealth, however, I continue to feel that I was one of the wealthiest, happiest, and most lucky persons on this planet, because I had discovered the solutions to communicate with the pure and beautiful energies of the great universal law of nature. And it is my sincere belief that this is the connection that all of humanity has tried to find for thousands of years. But it's very important to recognise that unless we have practiced for many years these routine, disciplined daily practices, just like these very gentle Tibetan Buddhist monks, to fully develop altruistic emotions and behaviours of the collective consciousness, to fully develop to become stored and take over control in our long-term memories, so that our long-term memories can be free and released from all ego, emotional, behavioural patterns, it would be absolutely impossible for any of us to experience this heightened level of existence. At the same time that this was all happening, I also began to receive small visual signs and messages from the great universal law of nature. For instance, I began to see many different rainbows everywhere I went. This was my confirmation that the pure universal law of nature was with me, sending me these signs and messages. For instance, a friend of mine sent me an email one day. She had arrived on holiday and asked me if I could take her for a walk in the mountains, because she was not familiar with the walks. And so I happily agreed to take a day off from my peaceful external daily meditation practices to take my friend a short walk in the mountains where I live. I decided that the best place was to hike up to a small waterfall that is only a short 3-kilometre walk. After we arrived early that morning, we slowly ambled our way up the steep, winding dirt track, crossing over the stepping stone rocks and over cool, crisp, clean streams and small wooden bridges, shaded from the sun, under the lush, densely canopied platanus trees, that eventually arrived up at the pure, crystal clear running waters of the small waterfall. It was a hot day and a long steep walk uphill on the rough dirt track, and by the time we got to the waterfall we needed to sit and rest a while. Strong rays of the sun began to shine brightly on the waterfall. Tiny droplets fell from the strong flow of the crystal clear waters, creating a small, strong rainbow to suddenly appear. This rainbow was my own personal message and confirmation that the purities of the universal law of nature were all around me. My friend and I sat on the rocks and had our hot herbal tea and a small breakfast that I had prepared early that morning. It was peaceful and still, and it felt like an extremely sacred place. And while my friend and I were quietly sitting together having our breakfast, a couple arrived with their 3 teenage children and a beautiful cream-coloured Labrador dog. We gave our greetings to the family and the dog and carried on with our breakfast. The 3 children were playing at the waterfall. Nobody was taking any notice of the teenagers playing. And then, all of a sudden, one of the boys playing by the waterfall suddenly shouted, "Look what I've found!" He was standing, holding a handful of money that someone must have placed behind the rocks at the waterfall. I knew that this was a small gift, a small miracle that this young boy had been given, and although I was not able to explain these reasons to this young boy, I knew myself these reasons. The young boy was ecstatic. He was overwhelmed with these magical feelings of happiness, because when we were all young children, most of our young, altruistic emotions are innocent, happy, childlike and pure emotions. because our long-term memories are not yet fully developed with all of our different ego emotions. Because once we all get to adulthood, our ego survival behavioural patterns take over control in our long-term memories and begin to suppress all of these pure, happy, innocent, childlike, altruistic emotions. This is why there are many young children that are able to receive similar small gifts and miracles, just like this young boy, because young children are more aligned with these pure altruistic emotions before life gets hold of us in young adulthood and all of our individual and different ego struggles and fights for our own individual survival kicks in, fighting to gain money for our survival. And this is how, in adulthood, all of our childlike, pure, happy, innocent, altruistic emotions start to get suppressed in our long-term memories. All of the pure and innocent young childhood happiness and trust we had with each other begins to disappear when we begin to interact with many different individuals that have fully developed many different extreme ego-driven behavioural patterns already mentioned in Chapter 3 that begin to cause many of us to experience so much hurt, fear and distrust of each other. But this is the beginning of the end of all of these pure, happy and innocent childlike altruistic memories, because for the rest of our lives our memories will begin to store all of these fears, distrust, hurts and many different ego emotional wounds and suffering that we all pick up, fighting to survive, interacting with many individuals' extreme ego behavioural patterns. This is how all human and animal suffering begins to develop, because it's not only humans that suffer for these reasons. All animals also develop emotional fears, hurts and distrust of us humans in these exact same ways. But animals have one enormous disadvantage over us humans. They cannot write books or speak of this emotional pain and suffering. Instead, you can only tell they have received this emotional abuse by witnessing the change in their behaviours. I certainly know that these small gifts and miracles that were given to this young boy by the great universal law of nature certainly happened in similar ways to me as a young girl. However, I was never able to understand what was happening, and it was not until many, many years later, when I had completed these 3 levels of focused attention, mindful meditation practices, that I finally began to figure this all out. However, although this young boy was so excited and happy at his discovery of this money at the waterfall, his parents didn't seem to care or consider this gift and miracle to be an important event at all. And so only I knew the significance of this small gift and miracle, because only I knew that this small event was going to make a significant impact on this young boy's memory for the rest of his life. And he needed to know that this event was extremely important and that miracles can really happen. This is why we must all try really hard to never let go of all of our pure, authentic, altruistic emotions. Because I hope by now that you are beginning to realise that our advanced altruistic emotions have the ability and are the only solutions to connect our pure thought patterns, so that we can all begin to find the solutions to all receive similar small gifts and miracles from the great universal law of nature. I began to speak to this young boy and express my surprise and to congratulate him for finding this small gift. Of course, I didn't attempt to explain how it had all happened, but maybe one day, as an adult, he may one day pick up this book and finally discover all of these reasons. So you see, it's not just a myth about the pot of gold found at the end of the rainbow. And throughout that day, and throughout every day, small rainbows and small miracles appeared to me that were unmistakable and without a doubt small signs and messages received from the purity and beauty of the great universal law of nature that created us all and created all that belongs to our home, our fragile Mother Earth, and our universe. And still, even today, a few years later, even after many years when I had completed this book, the great universal law of nature began to connect again by sending me away to experience visual signs that all Earth's nature has been created through rainbow energies, but this is a story for another day. There are many very special people throughout our modern world today who don't even recognise that our Earth and the great universal law of nature already has a special connection with them. A few of these very special individuals have been known to reply with some extremely inspirational reasons, such as, it clears the mind and feeds the soul. The small pleasures of seeing the sunrise on a mountain, sunsets, rainbows, aurora borealis, catching the light on the mountain. Does it get any better than this? I don't think so. It's medicine for the soul. Staying alive on top of a mountain, sweeping ridges, snow-capped mountains, sunsets, mist in the glen, views to die for. What more does the soul need? Being alone in the peace and silence in nature brings us closer to the heavens. I had no expectations for this trip at all. Just to be out here was enough. And then nature gave me this unique moment. It's awesome. You can also find a small list of many very special individuals that can be found all over our world today that volunteer their time each day to protect all that is vulnerable that belongs to all Earth's nature in all different non-profit capacities without expecting anything in return, no monetary rewards, no praise and no recognition, found in the index for Chapter 12, Level 2, along with many of their articles, educational vlogs and website links, etc. Conclusion. This book is the story of my own personal journey of emotional adaptations that began with my very first, very early childhood emotional events, and through a lifetime's search took me full circle to rediscover and reinstate many of my altruistic emotions that became suppressed throughout my adulthood, struggling and fighting for money to survive as a human. And among many other emotional events, developed my dominant ego emotional behavioural patterns to become stored into my long-term memory. When I set out, I had no idea what I was about to discover. It was a very long, hard, determined and disciplined journey. But in the end, it was worth every single minute of that determined struggle. Because along this journey, I discovered that monetary wealth can't buy my happiness. Complete happiness can only be achieved through spiritual wealth. But this path is not easy because it requires us to release ourselves from all materialism. Because money feeds, drives, controls and increases all of our different ego emotions to become fully developed in our long-term memory. And instead, throughout these many years, I began to appreciate my very simplistic lifestyle, surrounded by nature each day and appreciating the purity and beauty that belongs only to all Earth's nature, walking alone in peace and silence, connecting with and admiring all of the purity and beauty of the different wild flowers, birds, trees, goats and sheep in the hills and mountains, and all of the peace and silence surrounded only by all earth's nature. The vivid blue cloudless skies contrasting with the deep green grass fields at my feet, admiring and giving my gratitude for all of the different wild trees and plants, lizards and reptiles met along the dirt tracks, and the early morning's peaceful greetings from the local goat farmer, the simplicity of my life, all created by the great universal law of nature and Mother Earth, that I continue to admire and give my gratitude for creating all of this purity and beauty that surrounded me each day. And I began to ask myself, who could doubt the presence of a divine hand in the creation of all of this? It was all on my doorstep. I didn't need to travel long distances and use overconsumption of fuel to experience all of this. I began to live a very simplistic lifestyle, appreciating my connection to all that belongs to all Earth's nature, and even living on a simple basic vegetarian fresh foods, and sometimes even growing my own organic foods whenever it was possible. I stopped buying all unnecessary consumer products, and instead I stitched and glued all of my old domestic items, clothes, shoes, and any other items that I needed over and over again. And many of the luxury items that I had purchased in the past had all packed up, my dishwasher, cooker, hoover, etc. But I managed to survive without these modern items, and I also continued to recycle all of my few small items of waste, food, consumer product packaging, plastics, cardboard and paper, tin cans, glass, etc. And whenever I needed to go to food shopping, I took my own bags to the supermarket instead of buying plastic bags. And whenever I walked outside in the nature, I picked up the human waste rubbish and took it to the recycling units. And I weighed up all of the environmental impacts to our Earth's resources and all of the global warming issues if one day I bought a new car. So instead, I kept my very old, well-serviced car and used my car only for emergencies. And instead, I used buses and local transport whenever I could. And I stopped travelling on aeroplanes unless it was for emergencies, and instead I spent my time connecting to all of the beautiful places in nature that I wanted to visit through virtual vlogs on YouTube. And I stopped buying any new digital technology consumer products, but instead remain using my very old laptop that I can now have for more than 10 years. And because my Mac updates regularly and is very sturdy and reliable, I have never needed to update or buy any new modern technologies, and I never bought a smartphone. Instead, I remain using a very old, simple, basic but reliable mobile phone that has now lasted more than 10 years. And all of my old digital products that packed up in the past have all been given to the recycling centres. And I continue to feed and rescue any stray and vulnerable animals, and always supported my local non-profit animal rescue shelters that were always overburdened in my country. And I still continue to support many different individuals and non-profit organisations that many work voluntarily all over our world today to protect all vulnerable that belongs to all Earth's nature in all different capacities that you can find in a small list in the index for Chapter 12, Level 2. But most of all, I continued every day to give my huge gratitude to the great universal law of nature for allowing me to experience this ultimate level of human existence and all of these gifts and miracles, because this ultimate level led me to live for a short period of time a life that felt like paradise here on earth. I will never ever forget these amazing experiences and my connection with the great universal law of nature. I had gone full circle. I had reached the highest level of human existence that any man or woman could ever experience in one person's lifetime. But now the need to gain money for my survival was calling. It was now time to return and to join the real world of materialism. I had spent the last 10 years experiencing all of these three incredible levels of emotional adaptations, but now I had no choice but to go back to a mundane job and back to chasing money for my own individual and material survival. It was a very, very sad day having to enter this world of materialism again, because I knew that I would once more begin to fill my long-term memory with all of my different adult ego emotional behavioural patterns through all of my individual ego fights and struggles for my own human survival. And although I had no choice but to return to this materialistic world, I will never ever forget these three heightened levels of life-changing experiences. Of course, we all need money for our survival, but every single one of us has now become slaves to money, because money is now changing our behaviours. It is controlling our behaviours and causing many of us to experience huge amounts of suffering that belong to the ego. And unless we are willing to all stop chasing money and instead begin to work together through the emotions and behaviours of the collective consciousness to take care of each other and take care of all vulnerable that belongs to our fragile planet Earth, through storing in our long-term memories dominant we are altruistic emotions of empathy, loving kindness, compassion, unconditional love, positive thoughts and positive emotions, peaceful thoughts and peaceful emotions, non-violence and generosity of our human spirit towards ourselves, towards each other, and most of all, towards all vulnerable that belongs to all Earth's nature, we are going to continue to rapidly head towards our own human downfall. And none of us will ever get to experience these three ultimate and heightened levels of human existence. This is the reason that my allegiance lies and will always lie in the protection of our fragile planet Earth, for without her protection, our human lives will cease to exist.